Chapter 10. Mornings were hurried. Gina and Lisa developed a routine of holding each other's places in line for the bathroom, then dashing in together to spend as much time as possible in front of the mirror before the other girls banged on the door. Gina showed Lisa how to achieve the fashionable pin curls that would best survive the scarves and hairnets required at the factory. Plots & Sons was organized by floor. Women's garments on the third, men's on the second, offices on the first. Lisa was assigned to men's trousers, considered a good place for a beginner. She was surprised by the speed of the work, having been used to her father's meticulous style of double stitching and finished seams. Clearly, the goal at Plots & Sons was quantity, not quality. Lisa was given the machine next to Mrs. McCrae, a nice woman who patiently explained the intricacies of the job. By the end of the day, Lisa's arms ached and her fingers were sore, but she was grateful that the difficult work demanded her total attention. That way she had no time to worry obsessively about her family or whether a sponsor for Sonia had been found. But of course, thoughts of her sisters were never far from her mind, and she decided to go to Bloomsbury House later in the week. The chaos at Bloomsbury House was still in full swing. More children were arriving on the twice-weekly trains. Almost 10,000 had come already. Young boys in tweed jackets and ties and girls clutching dolls wandered the hallways. Lisa was again assured that Sonia was on the list, but there was still no word on a sponsor. Mr. Hardesty's secretary handed her a letter that had just arrived from Vienna. The stamp on the front had a picture of Adolf Hitler. Lisa quickly ripped into the envelope. "Dear Lisela," she read in her mother's familiar handwriting, "I am afraid I have no good news to report, except that, other than your father's arthritis, we are in good health. Sonia is anxious to join you soon, and it is with difficulty that we have patience to await our turn for the train. Rosie and Leo, too, are trying to come up with plans to join you. I pray they succeed. I hope you are practicing your music. I will send remembrances from home, so you do not forget us. Love, Mama." Tears were running down Lisa's cheeks. Forget them! How could she forget them? They were her very soul. That night, Lisa sat next to Gunter and Gina at dinner, and they saw how worried and withdrawn she looked. "Are you all right?" Gunter asked. "All I can think about is how to help my sister get a sponsor, but I don't know what to do." "Where is she?" Gunter asked. "She's still in Vienna. She has a place on the train, but they haven't found a sponsor." "You should do what Paul did," Gunter said. "Paul, come here," he shouted down the table. The blond boy hurried over and squeezed in beside them. "Tell Lisa about your idea." Gunter turned to Lisa and explained. "Paul's brother is still in Munich. I went through the phone book for people with my same last name, then rang them up." "Why?" Lisa asked, not yet understanding. "I told them I thought they are my relatives. Who knows, maybe they are." Lisa's eyes lit up. She would try it immediately. After hurrying through dinner, Gunther, Paul, Gina, and Lisa huddled over the heavy phone books of London Northwest. Lisa quickly turned to the J's, Hurra. Dragging her finger down the page, she found Jurasek and then several justices. There were no Hurras in this part of London. Aaron came in the room, leaned over the phone directory with them, and listened for a moment. "Try Y instead of J. People change the spelling sometimes." She turned quickly to the last page. There was nothing between Young and Joseph. "Wait! My father's cousin, Danzinger. We could look for the cousin's name." There were plenty of Danzingers in the phone book, especially in the predominantly Jewish neighborhood nearby, Golders Green. "I'll help," Aaron offered. "So will I," said Gina. "Me too," Gunter chimed in. "We'll each call 4 of these numbers tomorrow," Gina offered. "We'll call ourselves the Committee for the Resolution of All Ills," Aaron pronounced. Aaron put his hand in the middle of the table, and Gina, Paul, Gunther, and Lisa put their hands on the top. "We're the committee, right?" "The committee we are." Lisa received permission from Mrs. Cohen to switch her practicing to the hour after dinner so that she could spend time after work canvassing the neighborhoods. Knocking on doors proved more tiring than she had anticipated. None of the Danzingers said yes. Lisa had begged the people at work, but they were all as poor as she was. She knocked at shops near the factory and never thought of giving up. She'd get Sonia out no matter what. At the end of yet another unproductive afternoon, Lisa walked up Rifle Road back to the hostel. A voice stopped her. "Young lady, come here a moment, please." It was the neighbor lady in black, leaning on a large wooden-handled rake. "I have too many cucumbers and tomatoes this week. Would thee take them to Mrs. Cohen for me on your way?" "Of course," Lisa said politely, surprised at the strange English. "I'll get thee a bag. Please start under there," she said, pointing to a dark green plant. Lisa hesitantly lifted the large leaves and was surprised to find half a dozen cucumbers waiting. She snapped them off and piled them on the lawn next to a neat stack of already picked tomatoes. The woman still hadn't come back. Lisa waited. Overcome by temptation, she reached for a juicy tomato and bit in. The woman came out the door just as the warm juice exploded over Lisa's chin and blouse. My, look at thee." It was just an overripe tomato, but after a day of frustration and exhaustion and doors shut in her face, Lisa couldn't control herself and burst into tears. "It's nothing to worry about. I'll get thee a towel." When the woman returned, Lisa was still crying. The woman handed her a plain handkerchief, and Lisa gradually calmed herself. "Tell me, what's the matter, dear?" the lady asked with concern. Lisa didn't say anything right away, but finally she found a voice. "My sister is still in Vienna. Please, do you know anyone that could help us and be a sponsor?" The woman's name was Mrs. Canfield. She was a Quaker, a member of the Religious Society of Friends. She listened carefully to Lisa, then promised to do all she could. She explained a bit of Quaker philosophy to Lisa, who was in no shape to understand it. Accepting the handkerchief she was offered as a gift, Lisa backed out the door, carrying the vegetables up the street with a glimmer of hope in her heart. 2 days later, Mr. Hardesty called to leave word that a Quaker family in the north of England had agreed to sponsor Sonia, and that expedited calls were being made to the Jewish Refugee Agency in Vienna. Sonia would be on the train within the week, and Lisa was delirious with joy. On Friday, September 1st, 1939, Lisa came home early for Shabbat. After the lighting of the candles, Mrs. Glazer read aloud from the air raid precautions pamphlet that had been delivered to the hostel that afternoon. The total blackout of London had been ordered. In anticipation of the bombing, bolts of black cloth were to be made into curtains and hung in the windows so that no light would shine through. Gas masks previously stored in the basement were to be placed at the head of each person's bed. When the sun set that evening, no streetlights came on. Everyone gathered around the radio, which Mrs. Cohen had switched on in spite of the fact that it was the Sabbath. The hushed children listened as the BBC reported that 1 million Nazi soldiers had marched across the border from Germany to Poland in the last 24 hours with lightning speed, headed for Warsaw. A new word was added to the vocabulary: Blitzkrieg. The next morning, 3 of the nuns from the convent next door brought boxes filled with tins of food. "We are cleaning out the larder. We've been ordered to evacuate," one of them explained. "Thank you very much, sisters," Mrs. Cohen said. "We'd like to offer you the use of our basement. The air raid warden says it's the best basement on the block for a bomb shelter." Mrs. Cohen thanked the sisters profusely, while Lisa helped carry the tins of sardines and meats to Mrs. Glazer, who read the labels, checking for non-kosher ingredients. When she came back to the foyer, the nuns were leaving. One turned back and addressed Lisa. "We'd like to thank you for the beautiful music. We'll miss it." "Thank you," Lisa said, blushing. "Miss Ura, will you come with me to my room?" Mrs. Cohen said, closing the door. As Lisa entered Mrs. Cohen's inner sanctum, the matron said, "I understand your sister is to arrive today." "Yes, ma'am." "Mr. Hardesty called me to discuss where to send you. I understand that Mrs. Canfield has friends who will take Sonia, but that it might be difficult for them to take you as well. I told him that we would be willing to keep you here, even though we'll only be allowed 30 ration books, and you would be our 32nd person. We'd be willing to tighten our belts a little bit, if you'd like to stay." Lisa bowed her head in gratitude, and to hide the tears that were being shed all too often, she nodded. "Thank you very much," she whispered. "That's settled then. Please close the door behind you." Lisa went to the door, but Mrs. Cohen called her back. "Wait a moment," she said, opening the doors of a mahogany dresser and lifting out a stack of sheet music. "Would you like to borrow this?" Lisa's eyes widened at the sight. It was Chopin and Schubert and Tchaikovsky. A name was penciled neatly on the top of each book, Hans Cohen. "Thank you so much, ma'am," she cried. Sonia was due to arrive on the 3:22 train at the Liverpool station that afternoon. The train station was a madhouse. As fate would have it, the children of London were being evacuated that very weekend, and long lines of English toddlers were being organized by their parents and volunteers. Lisa located the volunteers from the Bloomsbury house, and they helped her to find Mr. and Mrs. Bates from Norwich, who also spoke with the odd-sounding thous and these. They offered reassuring words about their farm and about their daughter, who was Sonia's age, and together they went to look for the special train coming in on track 16. The waiting was agony for Lisa, but finally children began to emerge from the kinder transport. Sonia was wearing her heavy maroon coat, even though the weather was warm. When Lisa saw the frail and serious 13-year-old come down the steep steps, she thought she would crumble on the spot from the rush of emotion and relief. Breaking away from the couple, she ran to meet Sonia, grabbing her tightly in her arms, calling her name over and over. "Sonia, Sonia, you've come, Sonia." For a long moment they held each other, and it almost seemed she was home in Vienna again. Lisa was desperate to make good use of every second of the 30 minutes they had together. The sisters embraced all the way to the first-class cafe on the second floor of the station, where they were left alone for a private reunion. Grasping her pale sister's hand on top of the white tablecloth, Lisa called the waiter, proudly showing off her English by ordering tea and sandwiches. Sonia politely nibbled at the unfamiliar food, while Lisa opened the package that her sister had brought her from Vienna. Her heart leapt to her throat. Inside was a silver lame evening purse that had belonged to Malka's grandmother, and a book of preludes by Chopin, the one her mother had helped her learn. It seemed like yesterday. She was overwhelmed by emotion. Opening the letter from her mother, she read, "Your father and I are so comforted to know that you and Sonia are both at last safe in England, away from the dreadful place that our home has become. We are putting every effort now to find a way to get Rosie out. Take good care of our littlest treasure, Lisa, and know that all our prayers are for the day when we will be reunited." Attached to the letter was a photograph of Abraham. She was so grateful to have his picture, for, try as she might, it was harder and harder to remember all the details of her beloved father's face. She stared at the photograph and was shocked to see that his hair was now totally white. The 30 minutes passed in a heartbeat, and Mr. and Mrs. Bates returned. Lisa embraced her sister, trying to reassure the trembling child. "The minute the bombing is over, you'll come to London with me, I promise." Sonia clung to her older sister, too frightened and emotional to respond in words. "I'm so sorry, but we mustn't be late for the train," Mrs. Bates said, taking Sonia's hand. "I promise." "Sonia, Lisa cried reassuringly as the three of them walked away. She watched them disappear, then broke down, tired of being brave beyond her years. The next morning at 11:15, the residents of 243 Williston Lane put aside their chores and huddled again around the wireless to hear Prime Minister Chamberlain announce formally what everyone had long suspected, that Britain was declaring war on Germany. The rest of the day was spent preparing a bomb shelter in the basement of the convent next door. Everyone pitched in, carrying sandbags and buckets of earth to use in case of fire, and stocking the cellar with first aid supplies. Finally, they dragged down their mattresses and linens and set up cozy corners to sleep in. Lisa looked over at Paul, whose face was drawn and lifeless. He'd been given the news that afternoon that no more transports would be allowed to leave Greater Germany. No more sisters and brothers would be coming until the end of the war. Lisa had been the lucky one. Sonia had arrived on the very last train.